While many people know about Willard Carpenter, the women in his life are not so well known, but his wife, daughter, and granddaughter were rather unconventional ladies who deserve a closer look. Now, Lucina Berkelow Carpenter was born in New York State. She was the third of 8 children born to Elizabeth Wood Barkelow and Levertson Barkelow. Her father was a small-scale farmer at the time she was born, at least according to the 1820 census. By 1850, his farm was valued at $1,000, and he raised sheep, wheat, rye, and corn. Willard Carpenter was a Vermont native. He was 15 years her senior when they married in 1837. He'd worked as a traveling peddler, a school teacher, and a laborer on the Erie Canal before he returned to school teaching in Troy, New York. While he was there, he began a grocery business with his older brother John, which soon expanded into a dry goods business. When their younger brother A.B. Carpenter settled in Evansville in 1835 and established a dry goods business there, he persuaded his 2 brothers to join him in a joint venture. But the U.S. financial crash of 1837 led the business to split in 2, with Willard and A.B. taking up the Evansville branch. Now, somewhere in this period, Willard and Lucina married. I've been unable to locate any contemporary record of their marriage, but the 1873 publication, Evansville and Its Men of Mark, suggests that they were married in February of 1837. However, their daughter Marcia was born only 7 months later, in August of that year, so this date may not be accurate, although it is possible that Lucina was pregnant when she married or that Marcia was born early, but there's no evidence either way. During the 1840s and 50s, while Willard Carpenter was involved in various financial and real estate deals and became heavily involved in politics, Lucina was raising their 3 children. Like most women of her era, she was virtually absent from the public record. No surviving newspaper accounts mention her activities, and when Willard Carpenter gave a splendid ball in 1845 at the Exchange Hotel to celebrate the passage of an act bringing a branch of the Wabash and Erie Canal to Evansville, the Evansville Weekly Journal newspaper mentioned that, quote, a bevy of beautiful dames and demoiselles, end quote, attended and it commended Carpenter for hosting such a lavish event. However, there's no mention of the host's wife being part of the festivities, and it's possible that she didn't actually attend. The ball was held on March 19, 1845, at which point Lucina was 5 months pregnant with her son Albert. In the 1860s, Lucina became involved in charitable activities that were considered eminently suitable for a respectable woman of her social class. She was active in the Presbyterian Church, and in 1867 she was prominent enough in Evansville society to be mentioned in the press for simply having attended a large church social. She was a supporter of the Mission Sabbath School, serving as a volunteer teacher and a member of various committees. In 1870, Willard Carpenter gave a house and a lot to the Evansville Christian Home, and while he was on the Board of Trustees, Lucina served on the Board of Managers. This institution was founded in 1870 to, quote, assist women who have wandered from the paths of virtue and who are desirous of leading better lives, end quote. Ladies in particular were encouraged to support it by becoming subscribers. $5 paid annually gave them the right to vote in its elections, while $20 bought a life membership with permanent voting privileges. Now, men could pay these dues as well, but they could only be honorary members, so it's clear that this was a woman's organization. But the cause that appeared to attract a large part of Lucina's time and energy in the 1870s was temperance. Both she and Willard Carpenter joined the temperance movement, but Lucina was the one who was more active in it. She organized temperance activities in the 3rd Ward. She held meetings in her home. She co-hosted temperance receptions at local venues, and she even represented Evansville in regional temperance meetings held in Chicago and Indianapolis. The temperance movement appealed strongly to middle-class women. It was a public activity that was considered respectable and appropriate for them, even when it involved organizing, public canvassing, and attending out-of-town conventions. Middle-class women were supposed to be the mainstays of domestic life, caring for the needs of their husbands and children, and upholding virtue and morality at home so as to guide men and children towards ethical behavior in public and private. They were considered the angel in the house, and as this temperance image suggests, they were a beacon of love, purity, and fidelity. But if Lucina was a typical middle-class wife, her rights under the law were limited. It wasn't until 1879 that the Indiana legislature passed acts that allowed married women the right to their own personal property. And when I say personal property, this included their personal possessions, including clothing and jewelry, books, household furniture, stocks, bonds, investments, and even cash money. This legislation finally allowed wives to keep their wages or profits that they made from their own labor. Formerly, these had also been the husband's property. The legislation allowed women to sue and be sued in their own right, without any reference to the husband, which was a change from what it had been. However, this law did not give women complete control over any real estate that they owned. A wife couldn't enter into a contract to sell or otherwise convey her lands to someone else without the approval of her husband, and she also needed his consent if she wanted to lease her land for a period of longer than 3 years. At the same time, the law protected any property that a woman did own from being applied to her husband's debts. When a woman married, all her property became her husband's unless a contract was signed by the groom and the wife's family prior to the marriage that gave the bride the right to keep the property in her own hands. A similar provision could be made in wills to grant married women control of property that they inherited. So property that was legally possessed by the wife in these ways meant that her husband's creditors could not seize it to pay for his debts. Lucina Carpenter may have benefited from these laws following her husband's financial losses in the 1850s that were connected with the straight line railroad speculation. Carpenter had been heavily involved in this project, which was intended to build a direct rail line between Evansville and Indianapolis. But it failed in 1857, and he had to sell large amounts of his property to pay creditors. In 1879, however, 20 years later, it came out in a lawsuit that Lucina had actually secured property rights when her husband sold this property. In that lawsuit in 1879, Carpenter testified that he sold most of his land to his brother, and that Lucina made a separate contract with her brother-in-law to convey 1/3 of that property back to her. This percentage of 1/3 indicates that this may have been based on her dower rights under the law, which is called inchoate interest. So although Carpenter had to sell his property, his wife received 1/3 of it back. And while he couldn't sell that 1/3 without her approval, he could use it as the basis for future business deals. These inchoate or dower property rights were enshrined by law, so when Willard Carpenter decided to give an enormous grant to fund the building of the Willard Library in 1877, her consent was needed if clear title was to pass to the library's trustees. That's the reason why her name is included on the deed, which both she and her husband signed, even though all the rest of the documentation makes it clear that this is a gift by Willard Carpenter and not the two of them together. But even before the legislature passed the law granting married women property rights, it seems that Willard Carpenter had been assigning property over to his wife. And again, this might possibly be an effort to protect the property from seizure by his creditors. There's a strong suggestion of that in that lawsuit from 1879 against him by the Chatham National Bank of New York and the widow of J.J. Merritt. Together, they claimed that Carpenter owed them more than $12,000. But during testimony in the case, Carpenter claimed that he was virtually penniless. On further inquiry, however, it turned out that his wife Lucina was not penniless. The suit in 1879 involved a transaction that had taken place 6 years earlier, at which time Carpenter claimed that he had, quote, quite a large amount of real estate, but no money, means, or stock or anything, unquote. On June 1st, 1878, possibly because he knew this suit would be filed, he turned over to Lucina all the household furniture in their mansion and 250 shares of stock in the Evansville Rolling Mill Company. Next, Lucina purchased from her husband land near the mill for twice its estimated value. In his testimony, Willard Carpenter claimed that he owed his wife more than $50,000. And she would later be added as a defendant to this lawsuit, probably for that reason. I haven't found any record of a judgment against them, so this suit may have been settled out of court. Lucina was clearly conducting financial business in her own right in the early 1880s, and this is despite the fact that her husband was still alive. Here you see a note by Oliver Hobbs, who borrowed $125 from her in 1881 at 6% interest. A later lawsuit filed by Lucina's estate over this loan showed that it was secured by a mortgage on Hobbs's property. It's likely that she made other loans as well based on mortgages. The only reason we know about this one is that her executor foreclosed on the property when the borrower failed to pay off the note as scheduled. After Willard died in 1883, the city directory for the following year listed Lucina for the first time, calling her a dealer in real estate with an office separate from her home. Now, the directory entry for her son Albert implies that he wasn't involved in the real estate business, since he was listed solely as the secretary of a railway that linked Evansville with Ohio. When Lucina died later this year, she left behind property and cash that ran into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, since Willard had claimed to be broke only 5 years earlier, it may well be that Lucina had been involved in property deals for some time, leasing buildings and lending money on mortgages. Six years after Lucina's death, her executor was still selling her property. This notice appears to be the last of it to be sold, and it gives an idea of how extensive her holdings were. And remember that a number of properties had already been sold in both Vanderburgh and the surrounding counties prior to this notice of sale. Like her mother, Louise Carpenter bought and sold real estate, something really not expected of middle-class women of her day. But her unconventional behavior has more to do with her marriage to Converse Clement than to her real estate deals. Like her mother, we don't know much about Louise prior to her marriage at 17 to 23-year-old Converse Clement. He was a native of Vermont who'd arrived in Evansville at least as early as 1858. Converse Clement's career in the 1860s and early 70s suggests that he was a salesman with ambitious ideas, but that none of these tended to pan out. He clearly used family connections in this early stage of his career, and it's possible that he originally came to Evansville to join a relative. Jonathan H. Clement was a partner in the Evansville firm of Jewell, Newberry and Company by 1856, and Converse had a much older brother named Jonathan Hurd Clement, so these may be the same man. At the time of his marriage, Converse was working for that firm as a clerk, and he and Louise were living with her parents. In the 1861 city directory, he was listed as a clerk for his father-in-law, and they boarded at the Carpenter home. But by 1863, Converse had become an agent for Willard's brother, A.B. Carpenter. And by 1866, he'd become a partner in Carpenter, White, and Baker. This was a wholesale dry goods firm started by A.B., who by then had moved to Beloit, Wisconsin, and his oldest son, James, would replace him in the partnership. But James retired in 1869, which led to the creation of the Clement, White, and Company Partnership, also dealers in dry goods. This firm moved around in the subsequent years, but in 1870, Converse added another line of business representing a Chicago-based insurance company. Neither of these ventures lasted very long, and by 1872, the firm of the dry goods firm and the insurance brokerage appear to have been over. Converse's short-lived business ventures continued into the 1870s. He'd been active in buying and selling real estate in the 1860s, and at least 3 times his properties were listed for forced sale because he hadn't paid taxes due on them. Now, the listings you see here from the Evansville City Directory suggest the variation in his fortunes. Although he continues to be listed as a real estate broker, his office address constantly changes. In 1879, he had no listed office, only a residence. And in 1874 and 78, he was selling machinery as well. In 1879, he did pass the bar exam, so in 1881, we see him listed as attorney at law, notary public, and real estate broker. But this was the one and only time he was listed in this way. But it wasn't just the frequency of changes in business addresses and the listings that we see that were a sign of his financial instability. In 1875, he was declared a bankrupt, and his creditors agreed to accept 5 cents on the dollar. Although it may have seemed that Clement had made a financial recovery when he passed the bar and set up as an attorney, as I said, this career was short-lived, and in 1882, his listing in the city directory is for his residence only, with no occupation listed and no business office address. He was apparently trying to make a go of it as a shorthand writer and went as a delegate to the Shorthand Writers Convention in Chicago in September 1881. Yet on that same trip, he began exhibiting a new drill for mining. The following month, he exhibited the drill in New York, and Brown's Phonographic Monthly and Reporter's Journal, which was a magazine for shorthand writers, declared, quote, "No doubt Mr. Clement will make several fortunes out of his invention," end quote. Now, this may be an item that Clement submitted himself, although he's mentioned in several other issues in 1881. Apparently, the magazine thought so highly of him that they published this picture in brief biography. Undoubtedly, Clement himself supplied the information in the biography, which praises his long and successful mercantile career and notes his current business, quote, on a large scale. Through Converse Clement's many occupational changes, Louise and her daughters Lucina and Ruth were living at 216 Cherry Street. It could be that growing up, Louise had been used to family financial booms and busts, but there was added instability in her life that went beyond Converse's unstable employment record. In 1872, her father sued all 3 of his children and their spouses over real estate in the city. The suit was dropped, but the following year, Louise traveled on her own to Baltimore, Maryland, likely to visit her sister Marcia, married to a doctor in Frederick, Maryland. This may have been an effort to escape an unpleasantness at home, something she seems to have done later as her marriage collapsed. It's possible that this lawsuit had something to do with her husband's 1875 bankruptcy, although given his track record, it's equally possible he got into trouble all by himself. In 1881 and 82, Converse was traveling extensively. He spent the summer of 1881 with relatives in Vermont, and again all by himself. To what extent that accelerated or slowed down the breakup of his marriage is impossible to say. Louise was never listed in the city directories in the 1860s or 70s, and that's likely because people assumed she would live at her husband's address. She was clearly living there in October 1881 when she gave a birthday party for her younger daughter Ruth. According to the newspaper, the celebration included dancing and an elegant supper. But Converse wasn't home for this event. He was in New York demonstrating his new mining drill. In 1882 and 83, Louise and Ruth took extended trips, first spending 2 weeks at the West Baden Springs Hotel in September 1882, And the following summer, Louise and Ruth took a 3-month trip to visit relatives in the north. This likely included the family of her uncle, A.B. Carpenter, who, as I've said, lived in Wisconsin. By this time, it appears that Converse Clement had moved to Chicago. A brief notice in the Evansville Daily Journal on October 9, 1883, announced that Louise and Ruth were moving to Chicago, where, according to the paper, Converse had been living for many months. Possibly this was an attempt at a reconciliation, but if so, it didn't work. By 1884, the Evansville City Directory lists Converse Clement as boarding at 224 Cherry. It seems that the family home at 216 Cherry had passed out of their possession because Louise and Ruth were living with Louise's mother, Lucina, who had been widowed the previous year. After her mother died, Louise moved again, this time to 219 Mulberry. Louise had changed her name back to Carpenter by this time, and she declared herself to be a widow. Ruth, however, who lived with her, was still called Clement. Now, there's no record of any formal separation or divorce, so Converse and Louisa appeared to have remained married. But even if there had been a formal separation, it's unlikely that Converse would have been able to pay support for Louise and Ruth. It appears that she struggled financially. In 1887, she, her brother, and her late sister's husband backed a suit filed by Lucina Carpenter's executor to claim her inchoate interest in some property, but that claim was rejected. Then, in 1889, Louise sold several pieces of property for nearly $3,000. Today, this would be around $90,000. By this time, she was living with her married older daughter, Lucina. She continued to claim that she was a widow to the end of her life, and she apparently was getting younger. In the 1900 U.S. federal census, she stated that she was born in 1846 rather than her actual birth date of 1843. Then in 1897, Louise began the lawsuit that has made her famous in Evansville, the suit against the Willard Library trustees for $100,000. She alleged that they had beguiled her mentally incompetent father into giving them the donation to establish the library. Apparently, the suit stirred so much emotion in Evansville that the case was transferred to Princeton, where it was heard before Judge Wellborn. He quickly rejected the request by Louise's lawyers that the case be heard by a jury, which may have been more favorable to her. He then quickly found in favor of the library's trustees. But Louise Carpenter was undaunted by his decision and took her case to the appellate court. The court rejected her appeal, pointing out that her father had lived for 7 years after making the donation, and that she had waited for 13 years more before bringing the suit, even though she had argued that it was poverty that had kept her from bringing it earlier. The appellate court rejected her arguments and found in favor of the library. While we don't have any figures for how much this suit cost Louise, the Willard Library Board of Trustees minutes show that the library's costs ran into the thousands of dollars. If Louise had been financially hard-pressed before the suit, she was obviously much poorer at its end. Yet based on the suit filed in 1906 to force her to pay back taxes on property she still owned in Evansville, she clearly had some resources. Louise Carpenter and her daughter Lucina's family had moved to Massachusetts by 1903, but Louise appeared to split her time between her two daughters, and at that point Ruth was living on Long Island, New York. Louise Carpenter died at home at her daughter Lucina's home in Raynham, Massachusetts on February 8, 1908, and her death was from heart failure. According to newspaper accounts, her daughter Ruth was also by her side when she died. Her death certificate has some interesting errors on it, but one piece of information is correct. She was a widow. Her husband had died nearly a year earlier in March 1907, so after claiming to be a widow for more than 20 years, she actually became one in the last year of her life. But notice that his name on the certificate is listed as Connard C. Carpenter rather than Converse Clement. We can't be sure if this is an error by the clerk who misheard the name and assumed that the last name was Carpenter. After all, few married women had different last names from their husbands. But it could also be that Lucina, and possibly Louise, were reluctant to shed any light on the family's secrets that had led to the breakup of the marriage. That's likely why Louise claimed to be a widow for all those years. Now, how this certificate comes to call Willard Carpenter William and to make an error in his wife's last name is unclear. Well, if Louise Carpenter Clement could present herself as a widow for years, she was creating her own public image that avoided the stigma of being a divorced or abandoned wife. But her daughter Ruth far surpassed her mother in terms of reinventing herself. Ruth went from a popular society girl to a young wife to an actress to the wife of a Broadway producer to a political powerhouse, all the while reinventing herself to achieve her goals. While Ruth was still a little girl in the 1870s, local newspapers were inserting short notices that could be considered society news. So unlike her mother and grandmother, we can trace some of Ruth's activities as a girl through the press. Ruth's birthday party in 1881 made the news. So did her trips with her mother. These may well have taken place among other trips to places like Cincinnati, since that was the home of Ruth's first husband, Charles I. Park. They married in November 1885, and the newspaper account of the wedding described the wedding party assembling in the bride's mother's home, which at this time was 216 Mulberry Street, near the intersection which was the vantage point for this undated photo. The newspaper was lavish in its praise, calling the house beautifully decorated and saying that the numerous plants and flowers in it presented a scene bewildering in its loveliness. The guests were served really regal refreshments before the whole group went to the Church of the Holy Innocents for the ceremony. The account of Ruth's wedding also provides some insight into her character and personality. The article begins by saying that few people knew of the approaching wedding of, quote, one of the brightest and fairest of Evansville's daughters, unquote. Could this be an indication that Ruth was impulsive and entered into the engagement unexpectedly, leading to a quick wedding? Later, the article notes her light heart, sunny disposition, and dash and wit, all of which clearly made her popular. And given what we know about her future, these were qualities that apparently shaped her choice of career. Although the press declared at Ruth's wedding that she was destined for a happy home, carried there by the silken bonds of Cupid, that didn't last long. Something clearly had happened by 1889. In February of that year, Ruth and her mother sold property in Evansville that Ruth had inherited from her grandmother, Lucina Carpenter, the 2 lots on Clark Street just south of Pennsylvania. But the purchaser was Louise, Ruth's mother, who paid $1 for it, and for Ruth's interests in a second property in Lamasco, just to the north. While this property transfer may not have been a sign of trouble in the marriage, Ruth's decision to become a professional actress certainly was. 2 months after selling her real estate to her mother, Ruth made her stage debut. But if the Indianapolis Journal's account is correct, she may have been planning a career on the stage for some time. It could be that she felt stifled in her marriage, or perhaps her husband may have suffered financial losses that made her consider a career of her own. In any case, her stage debut was an exhibition put on by students of the Indiana-Boston School of Elocution and Expression under the direction of Mrs. Hattie Prunk. This took place at the Grand Opera House in Indianapolis on April 24th. Newspaper reviews of the event noted that, quote, Miss Park, end quote, was preparing herself for the stage and declared that she is, quote, a beautiful girl with natural grace of person, and she showed decided talent for dramatic work. But by August of that same year, Ruth was calling herself Ruth Carpenter. Although I haven't been able to find any evidence, it seems likely that she got a divorce from Charles Park. Either that, or he committed bigamy several years later. At the time of his death in 1894, a woman came forward claiming to be his wife, whom he had secretly married a short time earlier. While Park's family initially rejected her, she must have been able to provide sufficient proof not only to convince them, but the legal system as well. The probate court recognized her as Park's widow and granted administration of his estate to her, after which she sued Park's mother for a share of his deceased father's estate. While all this was going on, Ruth was touring the country, constantly receiving favorable reviews, even when the critics disliked the play. But several years into her acting career, Ruth's life took a turn that seemed as if it was written for the stage. She joined the traveling company of Jacob Litt, one of the most prominent and influential producers in American theater at that time. But apparently that status didn't impress her enough to toe the line. As this article from the Minneapolis Star-Tribune on June 30th, 1893 reports, Ruth walked out of a rehearsal because she thought that the lines for her part were too broad. This could be a euphemism for too vulgar. In any case, she was replaced in this play, but not in the company. Now, this paragraph from the Minnesota Times on September 2nd, 1894, suggests the reason why Ruth was able to continue in Litt's company after walking out of rehearsals and refusing to appear on opening night of the play. Apparently, Jacob Litt's interest in Ruth was very obvious, to the point that speculation about their marriage began in earnest in 1894. This wasn't the only paper to report rumors that the pair had married, and several weeks before this article appeared, Litt had publicly denied the assertions. Yet even as Jacob Litt was denying that they were married, he and Ruth sailed together for Europe as husband and wife, where the French newspapers announced the arrival of Mr. and Mrs. Jacob Litt. As this newspaper account declares, they continued to travel as Mr. and Mrs. Litt, even returning to America under that name. Finally, in August 1895, representatives of Jacob Litt acknowledged that he'd married Ruth Carpenter and that the two were living happily in New York. This article says that Ruth had retired from the stage and, quote, is playing the role of a devoted wife, end quote. But that statement is literally true. She was only playing a role. She was not Mrs. Jacob Litt, at least not yet. Jacob and Ruth went to Europe several times in the 1890s, and on their trip to England in 1897, they made it official. They were married in a civil ceremony in London on June 25, 1897. Now, it's not clear why they delayed the marriage for so long. Even if Ruth had not divorced her first husband, he died in 1894, so there was no impediment there. Since Ruth gave up acting when she and Litt claimed to be married in 1895, it can't be that she resisted marriage so that she could continue to appear on the stage. However, it is likely that they claimed to be married when they started traveling and living together to preserve Ruth's reputation. But I do want you to notice one point here for the ceremony. Ruth had to admit that her last name was Clement, one of the few times that she did so after leaving Evansville after her first marriage. And I'll come back to this point in just a moment. Ruth was married to Jacob Litt for less than a decade. Early in 1905, he was placed in a mental institution where he died in September of that same year. His will, which had been made in 1900 when he was still sane, named Ruth as one of the 3 executors, along with his nephew Solomon Litt and his theatrical manager Alexander Dingwell. They were to continue Litt's theatrical business, running his theaters and supporting his traveling companies, for 5 years after his death. At the end of that time, everything was to be liquidated, and Ruth received 1/3 of the estate. Their children also received 1/3, and the other third went to various other bequests. Now, in the interim, Ruth was to receive $3,500 a year, which would be over $115,000 in today's values. Each son also received $1,000 a year, but this was held by the trustees to be used for their support and education. Ruth received all of Litt's household possessions, which not only include furniture but artworks as well, and she received the apartment that they had in Manhattan. She was clearly wealthy, which speaks volumes about the final chapter in her story that we're going to look at today. But back to Ruth's avoidance of her legal birth name of Clement. By the time that Ruth became a widow, her mother had moved to the East Coast and spent time at Ruth's residence in Manhattan. But her father, Converse Clement, had also moved east, still apparently trying to sell things. He was repeatedly quoted touting the benefits of Iron Ox, a quack remedy sold by mail. Why his endorsement should be quoted by a Detroit pharmaceutical company is unknown, and we don't know if he was paid for the use of his name. He appeared to travel about, and doesn't seem to have been counted in either the 1890 or 1900 U.S. federal censuses. Nevertheless, in the 1890s, he was listed in a local New York directory as a broker, then a real estate dealer. Presumably, neither of these prospered. By 1906, Converse Clement was destitute. In December of that year, he was admitted to the New York County almshouse. According to the admission records, he was in poor physical condition and had previously been treated as an indigent patient at Bellevue Hospital. Two things stand out on this admission form. First, he claims that he is a widower, and secondly, he claims as his relative Mrs. Jacob Litt of Long Island. So he clearly knew where his daughter was, but we have no idea if she was aware of her father's location or his state. Given the fact that Ruth changed her name from Park to Carpenter when she went on the stage, suggests that there wasn't a strong bond between father and daughter. Because she continued to stay close to her mother, it may be that she took Louise's side in whatever led to the breakup of the marriage, which was so dramatic that Louise reclaimed her maiden name and declared herself to be a widow. This raises the possibility that Ruth did know of her father's condition, but felt so strongly about him that she did nothing to alleviate it. In any case, when he died in March 1907, he was buried in a pauper's grave, which is where he remains to this day. Ruth went on to become a well-known society woman who later became politically active. She worked for the expansion of women's rights, she was prominent in Republican circles, and she even ran for Congress in 1924. She is remembered in New York today for her activism, but not for her career on stage. She successfully reinvented herself again. Lucina, Louise, and Ruth were women of the upper middle class in the later 19th century, a time where most wives were not actively involved in business, and where they were expected to stay married even when the relationship had broken down. This was a period where respectability was supposed to be the most crucial component of a woman's character. But when you broke the rules through your actions, a woman risked that respectability. But these Carpenter women, who were determined to achieve their goals, did break the rules, even if it meant behaving in unconventional ways.